Hi, you're watching Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone, and today I'm pretty stoked about the fact that Matthew Kadish is back for another in-depth discussion. For those who don't remember Matthew, he is the former screenwriter and director in Hollywood, who is now a novelist and author of the Earthman Jack space saga. Today, Matt and I are going to be talking about Avengers Endgame in some detail. We're going to go in-depth, all the good bits and the bad bits. And yes, there are going to be a ton of spoilers. So if you don't want anything spoiled, you still haven't seen the movie, and you don't want anything spoiled or ruined, you shouldn't be watching this video. Go away, watch the film, and then come back later. In the meantime, for everyone else, without any further ado, it's Matthew Kadish and I talking about Avengers Endgame. Matthew, welcome back. Avengers Endgame, the end of an era. Give me your brief Reader's Digest summary about how you feel about this movie now, because I think you and I both went to see it around within about 24 hours of each other. It's been a couple of days. What are your thoughts now?
Well, I personally really enjoyed the movie. I thought it was a really fitting and appropriate culmination of 11 years and 20-something odd other movies. It definitely is not without its issues, but I feel like the issues are minor enough where, you can kind of ignore them and just enjoy the movie for what it is, which is basically a big final act to all these Marvel movies that we've been watching over the past decade.
Yeah, that's probably a pretty good summation, I think. My experience of going to the theatre was I had a good and enjoyable film experience. I came out of it with a few little frustrations. Over the ensuing couple of days, I've probably thought a bit harder about, and there's a few more things that I've got questions about, which is, I guess, what we're going to do today is talk about those. But I think overall, and also I think they had a pretty monumental task, right? Trying to keep such a big fan base happy and conclude 11 odd years and all of those various threads and tie them together in some sort of cohesive way. I don't think you were ever going to keep everyone happy, right?
Well, I feel like Infinity War was a very well done film. It focused on the story in such a way where there were really no plot issues with that film. And if you look at Endgame as the second part of Infinity War, their one big movie, they continue on with this thread where all the different characters have their own kind of closures to the story. The only problem is they introduce a couple plot elements in Endgame that they don't really explain fully, at least to the extent that they make sense within the movie's own narrative logic. And those are really the only weaknesses to, I feel, Endgame, because I feel like Endgame is a good continuation of Infinity War, but because you introduce, I don't know if we're allowed to talk about spoilers here, but because you introduce a certain type of plot element into this movie, it creates issues that, you could tell they weren't completely thought through, and that kind of affects the narrative in a way that Infinity War didn't have to worry about. Infinity War is just a straight up, this is the story, whereas with Endgame, we're literally covering a decade's worth of films and characters and stuff within the context of this narrative.
Yeah, and I should repeat that spoiler warning that I started with at the beginning, folks. There are going to be plenty of spoilers in this. So if you haven't seen this movie, you've got no excuse from this point out, because we're going to get graphic with what happened in the plot. So go away, watch the film, come back later if you haven't. With that in mind, how would you rate this in the Marvel canon, the cinematic universe canon? I personally don't think this is the best Marvel film, Endgame, but others are claiming it is. What are your thoughts?
I feel like Infinity War is probably the best in the entire Marvel canon. I'd rate this high. I gave it 3.5 stars simply because of the plot issues that I kind of hinted at a little bit earlier. But it was way more enjoyable than something like Captain Marvel or Doctor Strange or even the Ant-Man and the Wasp movies, which aren't bad movies by any means, but they're not like what I'd call classic. They're at the level of Iron Man 3 and stuff like that. Whereas I feel Endgame is probably up there with some of the best of the Marvel universe, like Winter Soldier, Civil War, certainly Infinity War, and maybe like the original Iron Man and Thor Ragnarok. It's probably in that range there. It's I wouldn't rate it as number one, but it's probably in the top 10 at least.
It's hard not to like the a lot of what was on display in the film and some of those big tentpole moments that they had. They did do some of that stuff really well, despite the failings, I think.
Yeah, and you also have to take into account that this movie doesn't stand on its own. Like, you need to have seen Infinity War and you need to have seen a bunch of other Marvel films in order for the context to be as impactful as it's meant to be. So that also kind of detracts from the rating, I think, and the fact that someone who hasn't been following Marvel movies for the past decade can't just watch this movie and be like, oh, okay, it's a good movie. Like, they'd probably be like, what the heck's going on here? I don't understand what's happening.
Okay, let's get into some of the specifics. Captain Marvel, while she didn't ruin the movie, because I think a lot of people were really worried about that, I didn't really have too much of a dog in that fight. I still haven't been to see the Captain Marvel movie. I have no interest in it. And so I'll wait till it's out, freely available on Netflix, probably before I even watch it. But one thing that did strike me as odd about her character is there's a couple of things. Number one, the fact that she took off to investigate these earthquake occurrences, and that plot point never ever comes up or gets resolved again, and it just felt all too convenient. And secondly, when she was on screen, there's something for me that doesn't feel right about her chemistry in this mix, and that may change with the new roster of Avengers and what they're doing next. But for me, even when she was on screen, even though she's not a huge player in this, there's something about her chemistry. It just doesn't, it's odd. It doesn't, I don't know how you feel, but for me, it just didn't quite work.
Well, I know that they shot her scenes before they actually shot the Captain Marvel standalone film. So Brie Larson, in interviews, she even said that she didn't quite know who the character was while she was shooting her Endgame scene. So I think that might have something to do with it, or she was still trying to figure out who the character was. Another thing was, I feel like the Russos kind of felt like, they were kind of shoehorned with her because of, Marvel's future plans, and they didn't quite know what to do with her. So they just sort of removed her from the bulk of the movie. And I also found it odd that they replaced Brie Larson with a teenage boy like 10 minutes into the film. So that was kind of weird, but what are you going to do? Yeah. For those who don't get the joke, they cut her hair short and she looks like a teenage boy, to me anyway. So
I get the sense too that they couldn't really have her around when you think about it, for a couple of reasons. One is she would have ruined effectively any willing suspension of disbelief because she's just so powerful. I don't know how, like her abilities would effectively undermine what they're trying to do with the plot, I think. Secondly, I don't think you could have her there for that long a period of time when this has not been her story arc. This is really about Tony Stark and about Steve Rogers and all those other characters. And to insert someone at the last minute and then expect them to become the big centerpiece of that film, I think a lot of people would have been quite angry about that, and rightly so.
I think her character might have detracted from the stories of a lot of these other characters that we know better. And I think it was a calculated thing to, within the first 10 minutes of the movie, they find Thanos and she helps them kill him and stuff like that. So, she didn't really serve a purpose going forward. I mean, they could have kept her around and just kind of a role where she's, running around with the different teams and helping them out or something like that. I also think that there's the possibility that in the final battle during Act 3, Thanos, punches her with the Power Stone. And I think that there might be some room there for that to have affected her power level, because her power level came from the Space Stone. And as established in her standalone movie, the Tesseract was the thing that basically gave her powers. So being directly hit by an Infinity Stone could give Marvel the leeway they need to give her some vulnerability. Maybe she was injured from that blow and for some reason she's not as powerful as she once was, or what have you. But she is, her biggest issue as a character is that she's overpowered and she has no weaknesses. So I don't quite know how Marvel plans to address that going forward, but I feel like the movie's answer of just, getting rid of her because they didn't know what else to do with her was, kind of, a misstep on the writer's part. But what else are you going to do?
Tell me, you're a storyteller, you're a writer. Should this have been a trilogy? Because there's something niggling away at me that maybe they tried a little bit too much with the second film, and possibly, I don't know though if they had enough material to expand into three, but could it have been three films?
I think it might have been pushing it a little bit to turn it into a trilogy. I feel like the two-act structure that they kind of followed, where you have Infinity War and then this movie as like one big complete movie. I think it worked. I think it was okay. If you stretched it out into, because normally like a trilogy, you would need the middle act to be the act where things go wrong and the bad guys win, but the bad guys won in the first movie. So the only real way to go with this movie was to finish it up. And if you look back at Marvel's plan for this stuff, they always plan to do Infinity War parts 1 and 2, but they just changed it to Infinity War and then Endgame. And I feel like if you look at the first two Avengers movies, Avengers and Age of Ultron, as the first act of a trilogy, and then you look at Infinity War as the middle act, and then Endgame as the final act, you have that, story arc there. So I feel like it works. And I feel like the 3-hour runtime was probably necessary to get in everything that they needed to get in. And it's funny because if you actually look at it, like at the end of hour 1, that's the end of act 1. At the end of hour 2, that's the end of act 2. At the end, and then you have act 3 last an hour. And it was very well structured from a writing perspective, Endgame was. But I think that having Infinity War go right into this and having this be the resolution, I feel like it worked.
Tell me about Thanos, because I look at the character of Thanos in this film and I am a little bit disappointed the more I think about it. It's not major, it doesn't destroy the film or anything, but for me, he was an interesting villain with interesting motivations, and they basically took a classic trope, the apocalyptic doomsday thing, and they gave it an interesting spin in the sense that he was a psychopath who thought he was helping the world, he thought he was being altruistic, and then he also wanted to retire. He didn't want any power for himself. And I thought that was enough of a spin to make it interesting. This film, I felt a little bit like they've reverted to a more typical trope for this version of Thanos that we get. And some have said they should have just left him dead after Thor killed him and found another way to do things. I don't know how that would have worked, but what are your thoughts on Thanos? Because for me, he just feels a little bit too typical now, whereas he was more interesting, I thought, in the first film.
Well, in Infinity War, if you look at it from strictly a narrative perspective, that's Thanos' movie. Like, he's the main character of Infinity War. He's the one with the character arc. He's the one with the growth. And all the other characters are kind of reacting in response to him, and they're standing in the way of him achieving his goal. And throughout the course of the movie, he goes on this quest to, get all the Infinity Stones and snap his fingers, and he accomplishes that in the movie despite all the obstacles. And so, like, you could rationally argue that Infinity War, he is the protagonist of that movie. Now, my problem with this movie is that the Thanos that we get that fights back against the Avengers is not the same Thanos from Infinity War. For those who've seen the movie, you know that Thanos from 7 years prior comes into the future, and he's kind of the obstacle at the end of the movie that the Avengers need to unite against to defeat. And he's a different Thanos than the one that we kind of grew to know in the previous movie. Now, that's not to say that he's not inconsistent. Like, he's a pretty consistent character, but a lot of his history and relationship with these other characters is basically not there. Like, there's a very poignant scene where Scarlet Witch has a face-off with him, and she's like, "You took everything from me," and he's like, "I don't even know who you are." And that kind of robs that moment of, I think, some poignancy, because there was a great moment in Infinity War where he talks to Scarlet Witch after Scarlet Witch kills Vision to try to prevent the Mind Stone from falling into Thanos' hands, and she watches in horror as he rewinds time and then kills the love of her life again right in front of her eyes. So, I mean, there's that type of stuff is missing with this Thanos at the end of Endgame. And it's a shame, because I feel like it could have been a lot more poignant if a lot of that history carried over. but it also kind of would have been really complicated to get that point in the story the way they had it written. I feel like them just bringing Thanos in, because the Thanos that they brought in the third act of Endgame was basically Thanos at the height of his conquering power. This was before he started getting the Infinity Stones and inching closer to godhood. So it was basically just him at his most raw, conquering warrior phase. And I feel like that was a good enough obstacle because it really gave everything that the climax needed to have all these characters like face off with him once more, show how formidable he is, but still, just barely overcome him. So I feel like, it was well done, but it was missing a lot of the emotional impact because, he wasn't the same character that we saw in the previous movie. Now, it would have been interesting if they had somehow not killed him at the beginning of this movie, and that Thanos was the one who, they faced at the end of this one. So like you had all that history that could have been brought with them. But, I think it's fine as is.
Yeah.
But if you want to get nitpicky about it, it could have been a little bit better.
And I think this is one of the interesting pitfalls of the time travel device that they use. It's almost like they gave a big nod to the audience and said, look, you're going to have to just go with us a little bit here. How did you feel about that aspect of it?
Well, whenever you introduce time travel into a story, there's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. And the wrong way to do it is just kind of make it up as you go along. For time travel to really work, you need to basically clearly establish the rules of time travel and then make sure that those rules make sense within the narrative logic of the story. So, even movies that kind of treat time travel a little bit loosely, like Back to the Future or Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure or stuff like that, you excuse the problems that time travel creates because the movies stick to their own rules within the narrative logic of the movie. So as long as there's consistency there, the audience is willing to suspend their disbelief and just kind of go along with it. Now, the problem with Endgame was that they established the rules of their time travel, but the rules for time travel in Endgame not only contradict the rules for time travel that Doctor Strange established, the movie Doctor Strange, because if you go back and watch that movie, they actually have a lot of kind of like groundwork for manipulating time and time travel and stuff in that movie that kind of goes counter to what they establish in Endgame. But if you're just going off of Endgame, so basically they say changing the past does not change the future. That's their rule in Endgame. So you can go back in time, kill yourself, you don't disappear, you're fine. And I got the exact quote from Hulk and how he justifies this rule. And he says, if you travel to the past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. Now I ask you, does that make sense? The answer is no. It makes no sense whatsoever. And they say it so fast that you kind of don't have time to process it. But at the same time, if you take a minute to think about it, this makes no sense whatsoever. Because if you think about time is a construct that encompasses everything. So an individual time traveler who goes back in time, they can't like reestablish the future for everyone else based off of their individual experience. Now, if they had just said, hey, when the minute you go back in time, you create an alternate timeline, and we're going to use these quantum GPSs to get back to our timeline. So whatever you do in the past won't affect us because we're going back into a different timeline. If they had just said something like that, we would have been like, oh, okay, that's fine. We get it. But the way they explained it not only doesn't make any sense, but it could potentially be problematic for, future stories, because it's like, well, if nothing you do in the past affects the present, why don't you just go back in time and get a former version of Black Widow and Captain America and bring them back to the present so you have them? Nobody ever really dies because you can just go back and get a past version of themselves, bring them into the present, and, the timeline's fine. You don't have to worry about anything, there's a lot of issues that this brings up that you can debate over. But if you just want to say, okay, I'm just going to accept the rule that you can't change the future by changing the past, okay, it works, I guess. They didn't make sense of it within the narrative logic of the story, but I don't think they were trying to. I think they just wanted to get past it as quick as they could and get on with the story.
Yeah, and that's my sense too. I sense that they thought, okay, we're either going to get bogged down in a very complicated, and I guess too lore-heavy movie, because it's going to have to be this whole new scheme of how you view reality because of it, or we can just say, hey, wink, wink, nod, nod, let's just agree to disagree and get on with it.
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at Doctor Strange, like he establishes that you can go back in time and change the outcome of the present, right? So that kind of flies in the face of Hulk's whole like, well, you can't change the future by changing the past. It's like, well, Doctor Strange did it like multiple times. And they also stated that time travel goes against natural law, and there are consequences for going back in time or manipulating time in some way, shape, or form. And the Sorceress Supreme, the Ancient One who shows up in Endgame, she kind of hints at that, but she never really explicitly states it. So there's a lot of gray area that they've created, with the whole time travel narrative. And there are also issues within Endgame, like for instance, Thanos, the way he comes back into the present from 2014, I think, where Nebula, pretends to be the future Nebula, and she goes back to the Avengers headquarters and pulls him out. They established earlier in the movie that you needed the Pym particle to time travel through the quantum realm. But it's like, well, Thanos didn't have the Pym particle. How did his ship enter the quantum realm without that thing? And, you don't think about that when you're watching the movie, but if you stop and think about it for a minute, you're like, that's a big plot hole. Like they never established how Thanos' ship was able to be shrunk small enough to enter the quantum realm and then get re-ejected back into the future. And they also never established, well, okay, you can't change the future by changing the past, but how does removing you from the past and going into the future work? So there's this whole thing where it's like, well, if Thanos leaves 2014 and goes into 2025, he never does any of the stuff that leads to that present reality. And it's not a question of him having gone into the past, it's about him having gone into the future. So he basically removes himself from the timeline. So how does that work exactly? So there are all these like little nagging questions that you can easily dismiss if you just want to say timey-wimey space magic. But at the same time, like us rational thinkers, we're just kind of like, these might be plot holes.
Now, I'll come back to that because I think there's another one too with Steve Rogers potentially, and also about how this movie will be perceived going forward as a result of some of these things. But just let's stay with Thanos for a second. One thing I thought was kind of interesting is there's never any sense that they have a big critique of his motivations ever, either in this film or the previous one. And I contrast that with, say, Civil War, where they did a lot of talking about what was the right thing to do. Should we acquiesce to the UN or should we remain independent? It was this big ethical question. The whole idea of just slaughtering half of the universe doesn't seem to be that big an ethical quandary. It's for me, I guess it's the thing they just sort of take it as read, that everyone would be opposed to it, but they don't unpack so much anyone really saying this is why his motivation, this is what he's doing here, why it's so evil and wrong. You never get that big moment. And I thinking about it, I thought, yeah, that's kind of interesting that whereas, as I said, compared to Civil War, they do a lot of talking about that ethical question. Is it right to surrender our authority and power to the UN or not? And all those kind of things. And in this film, they just sort of, is it a time thing?
Well, I think that it's hard to have a ethical debate about Thanos' philosophy because every character that we're rooting for in this movie had a personal loss because of it. And I don't think that, mass genocide is ever the philosophically right answer to anything. So it's hard to argue that stance. I feel like there was a theory that came out before the movie that stated that Thanos' drive to remove half of all life in the universe was because he wanted to try to prevent Galactus from eating planets. Because if a planet's not full of life, Galactus is going to leave it alone because he only eats like planets that have, reached full maturity or high population or whatever. And I thought that was a really interesting thing because that could have been like, from Thanos' perspective, yes, what he did was horrible, but he was doing it because he understood a greater cosmic threat that not everyone else was aware of. And so he was willing to make these great personal sacrifices in order to, kind of prevent an even bigger genocide than the one that he perpetuated. And I was like, if Marvel actually goes that route, like that would have made Thanos' motivation like so much more clear and so much more interesting. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, they established why he wanted to do it. The reason is because he's insane. And that's not really the point of these movies. The point of these movies is to see these heroes that we've, spent the last decade with kind of in their journey as heroes. And let's focus on that as opposed to these smaller details. So one thing I will commend the writers on is that Thanos is definitely one of the best comic book villains ever put on screen. Like, he's not only multi-layered, but he actually presents a real threat to the heroes. And I think that's something that we miss in a lot of superhero movies, is having a villain that actually poses a threat to the heroes. Because you always know, the heroes are going to win, they're fine. But when it comes to Thanos, the heroes don't always win. And not only that, he's able to like just beat them into the dirt. So he's formidable on every level. And if you look at the climax of Endgame, he almost wins again. And so I think that that's what makes him so great, is because he's an actual threat to our protagonists, whereas opposed to lots of other comic book heroes, like they're just kind of an annoyance. Like they'll punch a hero and he won't even bleed. He'll just be like, eh.
And I think too, you're right, the stakes felt a lot more real as a result. Although I have already heard some people suggesting they're a bit frustrated. They felt that there seems to be a little bit of a writing inconsistency with his power in this film. So it seems that his abilities here in this film still seem to be at the same level they were at when he had all of the Infinity Stones and the Gauntlet at his disposal. I don't know. It didn't really stick out as much for me, that aspect of it. But some have said that maybe they felt he was overpowered in this film when he shouldn't have been.
As a Titan, as one of these original like aliens that walked the universe before, when the universe was still young. Thanos has always been a very powerful character. And if you look at, the Infinity War, back when he only had like one stone, he was still able to kind of go toe to toe with Hulk and Thor and beat the crap out of them without having to use the stones. If you look at the end of Infinity War, where all the heroes are coming at them and he has his glove and he's just like, like knocking them aside, like that's at the point where he's, kind of overpowered. But he's always been a formidable combatant one-on-one. Like, he's incredibly tough and he's incredibly strong and he's incredibly resilient. And so I felt like them using him at the height of his conquering power, where he's like an actual warrior and he's using his weapon and stuff like that against these characters, it shows just how formidable he always has been. And giving him the stones, just made him even more powerful and harder to defeat. So, yeah, there might be a little bit of inconsistency, but I think that's one of those things where your suspension of disbelief allows you to kind of forgive it, because, like, let's face it, that final battle with Thanos was pretty freaking awesome.
It was.
And so you're able to forgive a lot of this stuff where it's like, yeah, okay, maybe they're fudging the results a little bit, but it's all right. It looks good.
Let's talk about one other moment where we probably have to fudge the results a little bit, is the whole Tony Stark's able to make himself a glove now that's capable of holding the Infinity Stones. That does stick out. I guess the one get-out-of-jail-free card they might have is they could possibly argue, well, now they know more about what it takes, and so that possibly, even though it's not discussed in the film, that maybe Stark has figured out a way to do that. Now they understand the technology from the first film. I don't know, but it does seem to stick out, right?
Yeah, like a big plot point of Infinity War was that Thanos had to go to that, Starforge and get the dwarves there to create a gauntlet for him that could not only hold the Infinity Stones, but also like harness their power. And it was that glove that allowed him to manipulate the power of the stones to basically do whatever he wanted with them. Because like if you were just holding the stones in your hand, like, they'd destroy you, or you'd have to, focus on using one stone at a time or whatever. But that glove was really the thing that allowed him to harness all that power. So like when I got to the point in this movie where it was just like an Iron Man glove that they put like the stones on, it was just kind of like, I'm going to try not to focus on that too much, because it is a bit of a cop-out. But I think that there is an argument to be made that because it was just a regular Iron Man glove, that's one of the reasons why you saw like, everyone's arm get like, basically destroyed, burned up, shriveled up, whatever, and why it was so hard for them to, like actually harness the power of the stones is because the glove wasn't made for that. But yeah, that's a little bit of a fudge. It was just kind of like, well, we could add another hour to the movie of them going and getting another gauntlet made or whatever. Or they could have gone back in time and just stolen the gauntlet, pre-Infinity Stone collection or whatever. But I guess they just decided, you know what, for convenience sake, we're just going to, have an Iron Man gauntlet fist and just go with it. I'm okay with that. Like, that's one of the things I'm willing to suspend my disbelief over and overlook, just for the sake of plot convenience. But at the same time, it's like, well, they probably should have thought of that when they were writing the film, but I'll forgive them.
Staying with the topic of writing again, let's talk about everybody's second favourite Asgardian after Loki, Thor. And there's already a bit of controversy now being generated about the way they've handled that character. I thought the idea of making him this overweight guy who's just basically let himself go and doesn't care anymore, I thought that was an interesting concept. The thing for me, though, that is a little bit frustrating and weird is they also seem to feminize him a lot. He seemed to have hormone issues, and that didn't make sense because they set him up at the beginning of the film where he takes Thanos' head. He's this angry, despairing kind of guy now. And then all of a sudden, he's just a bit of a lout who's emotional. I thought it would have made sense if he'd let himself go and he was angry at the world and that had carried on. It works to great comedic effect in moments, but a lot of people are upset. And I get it, particularly the big Thor fans. They're quite upset about the way their man was handled. How did you feel about that?
Well, first of all, I feel like it's great that I now can say I have the body of Thor. And dad bods around the world are now considered to be like god bodies. So I'm cool with that. Like, I actually thought it was a very interesting choice because all throughout the movie, I'm like, he's going to drink a potion or he's going to get, shocked by lightning. And all of a sudden he's going to be the big muscular, Thor that we all know and love. And like, his fat's just going to go away. But they kept the fat bod all throughout the movie. Like, he's fighting Thanos with like an extra 50, 60 pounds on him. And I had to respect them for like committing to that choice. But I think that the important thing to note from the character's point of view is that his anger wasn't so much at Thanos and the world around him, it was at himself. And when you look at it like that, him letting himself go, putting on weight, drinking all day, playing video games, stuff like that, and trying to ignore everything else, like, that is self-punishment. It was all about him trying to punish himself for his failure because he was the one, from his perspective, he allowed Thanos to do the snap because he didn't kill him right away. Like, he had the opportunity to kill him and it was his fault that the snap happened. And so, like, that was his perspective. And he carried that weight on his shoulders. And you saw it all throughout, his storyline, where when they go to his new Asgard and they tell him to come join us at the team, and they're like, it's about Thanos, and he almost starts crying because he still carries the guilt and the weight of his failure with him. And so I think that from a writing character perspective, what they did with Thor was very consistent because I don't feel like he'd be angry at everyone else. I feel like he'd be angry at himself. And this was his way of punishing himself, is just, drinking himself to death or, letting himself go and trying to just ignore, all the things that he used to prioritize and stuff like that. So the scene where you're talking about where he gets kind of weepy with his mom and things like that, I also feel that's consistent because, he loved his mom. He lost all of his family. He carries these burdens with him, and his mom was able to kind of, help him come to terms with his guilt. And that allowed him to kind of move forward in the story to the point where he's actually able to, harness the power of Thor and be worthy of the power of Thor and fight with the Avengers in the final act. So I know that there's some like, oh, they're fat shaming, they're making it like a joke, controversy out there. But I don't really feel it's a controversy because I feel like speaking for all the fat people out there, I'm like, hey, we finally got a fat superhero. I'm cool with that, and it's one of those things where it was not only done in a really funny and creative way, because he's basically Big Lebowski in this movie. But it was also done in a way that wasn't like offensive, and it's like everyone can kind of get on board with the joke. So I'm fine with it, and I think it was well handled.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The fact that they left him with the weight, they didn't ever, because I was waiting for that as well. I was waiting for a Rocky training montage or something, how he was going to recover his former, gym physique. But he doesn't. And I think that actually tends to put paid to the lie that this was an attempt to ridicule people who are overweight, because they actually left him and gave him his heroic moment in that state, which actually says that they're really not trying to do that at all. And in fact, they're saying, hey, you can be a hero too, effectively.
And I would love it if they kept him at that weight for like Guardians of the Galaxy 2 and the next Thor movie. I think that'd be hilarious. And I also think it'd be really cool. I liked Fat Thor. I thought Fat Thor was just, it was a new take on the character, which was really interesting. And I liked it.
I love the Big Lebowski joke, the quip. That was great. And I also, when he fell asleep in the corner of the room, I thought it was hilarious. I think it's also great too how they've actually created an interesting little storytelling device for Guardians of the Galaxy going forward, because now they've got the potential to have a clearly overweight Thor who still has the ego of the good-looking Thor competing with Star-Lord, and that would be a fascinating, like when it's just two egos, two good-looking guys, it's not as interesting as when one of them clearly doesn't actually have the body to go with the ego that he's got. I think that could be real funny potential.
Also in Infinity War, they were kind of making fun of Quill, like you're one sandwich away from being fat. And then they were praising Thor, like, an angel had a baby with a pirate type thing. And then like in this movie, it's like reversed, where Thor is basically the overweight schlub, and Quill is like, all in shape, but yet Quill is still very insecure around Thor. So it was a very interesting setup for the next Guardians movie, I think.
It's fascinating because I think with that character, they probably took their lead from Taika Waititi and what he did. Taika Waititi, I think, managed to balance the sort of the traditional Thor with this new comedic Thor. They've really taken the Thor into the comedic realm. But I don't think they really knew what to do with Thor. If you look at the MCU, he's a pretty mixed bag throughout his films, and the prior outings with Thor, I think going the really serious route with that character, it didn't quite work, I don't think.
Well, I think at a certain point they realized that Chris Hemsworth is a very natural comedian, and the first two Thor movies were played very straight, and they weren't very good. But once they kind of figured out to play to Hemsworth's strengths, which was to allow him to be kind of funny and goofy, because before a lot of this stuff, like Joss Whedon kind of coaxed a little bit of humor out of Thor, and it worked really well. But then you had Chris Hemsworth. He did like these short films that they weren't widely known, but they were kind of on YouTube, where it was like Thor took a vacation, I think to Australia, and he had like a regular Australian roommate. It was like this regular guy and Thor, and these shorts were just hilarious. They were great, and I think Marvel was kind of like, what, this guy, his talent lies with comedy, so why don't we just play to his talents? And you saw that with Thor Ragnarok, and it worked spectacularly well, and they just continued on with it, and I think it's a good choice.
Let's get serious for a moment. A couple of deaths happened in this film. Let's talk about the first one, the death of Black Widow. So this is chronologically, obviously, when I say the first one. The death of Black Widow. Now, I have a couple of issues with this. Number one is, first question is, and you'll probably know more than I, did they change the mythology there, where all of a sudden you can sacrifice yourself to get the Soul Stone? When I thought in Infinity War, I thought you had to sacrifice something that meant something to you. So, Thanos sacrifices his own daughter to get the stone. Secondly, I felt that death just didn't have the impact and the poignancy that perhaps that character deserved. And then they just sort of quickly moved on, and it's almost by the end she was very much a forgotten figure in all of this. How did you feel about that first death?
I thought it was fine. Like, you have to realize that the sacrifice was Hawkeye's. Like, he did not want her to die, and she killed herself to get the stone for him, and so he was the one who felt that death, and that's what triggered the Infinity Stone. So that's the justification there. I do feel like maybe it could have been handled a little bit better. It could have been more poignant. One of the interesting things about Endgame is that all of the original Avengers kind of get closure to their arcs, their stories that started, way back, with their first movies or the first Avengers film. So you have Hawkeye, Black Widow, Hulk, Iron Man, Thor, and Captain America. Those are like the core Avengers, and each one of them kind of completes their story in this movie. So you have to look back at Black Widow and what was her story, what was her character arc throughout this series, and she was kind of probably the hardest one to pin down because, like, she was a government agent, and she had kind of a romance with Hulk briefly, but for the most part, she never really truly believed in anything. I think that was kind of the point of her being in the Captain America movies, like Winter Soldier and Civil War and stuff like that, where she was always looking for something to fight for. And that's one of the reasons why she loved being an Avenger, was because it gave her a purpose. And when Thanos snapped his fingers, she felt lost. She felt aimless. She felt like she didn't have a purpose anymore. And that was kind of her in the first act of Endgame, where she like had the weight of the world on her shoulders. She was kind of lost. She was very like red-eyed and teary. She was kind of running everything, but she just felt like she didn't have a purpose anymore. And her sacrificing herself to save, everyone else and to make sure that her best friend, got his family back, that was kind of like, okay, this is something I'm willing to die for. And so I feel like it's a proper closure for her character arc. I just think that her character arc was always very muddy to begin with, and it wasn't as clear as some of the other characters. And that might be why it didn't connect as well with you as some others. I know other people have said that they cried when she died and stuff like that, but we all know she's going to come back. They're going to bring her back somehow. So, but I feel like it was a proper closure for her arc.
For me, the interesting thing for that aspect of it was that basically we all knew, this was part of the problem, is we all knew what the Soul Stone entailed. Whereas if you think about Thanos, we didn't really understand until he got there, and then it's all explained to him. But we know that's what's going to happen here. So you've got two characters turning up, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, one of them's going to have to die, I guess. So the only other interesting way out of that probably is to actually write a storyline where they somehow figure out how to cheat the system to get the stone. Or, and I think this is perhaps what I felt was missing, was you actually you develop that moment a bit more. You give it more of that poignancy in the writing. And like what you've just talked about, I felt was the bit that's really sort of lacking, is that sense of her actually sacrificing herself. It just felt like two of them in a very rushed way competing to jump off the ledge. Whereas the build-up that's missing is really that whole sense of, no, I have to do this, let me do this. That aspect of it perhaps isn't as strong for me in that sequence.
Yeah, I could see that. Like I said, I feel like her story arc was kind of the most problematic to bring to a conclusion. And they probably did the most appropriate thing that they could have with her character. But yeah, they're going to bring her back. So I don't know how, but I'm not too broken up about her death, because I do think that she'll be brought back in some way, shape, or form.
Well, we can't snap the Infinity Gauntlet, but there's time travel, so
yeah. Like I said at the end of the movie, I was like, why don't they just go back in time and get a younger version of Black Widow and bring her to the present? It's like, that's what they did with Gamora. It seemed to work out. So
the other death is the death of Tony Stark. Now, how good was that moment? For me, the poignancy of that moment, and part of it was they actually did something that a lot of filmmakers don't seem to know how to do today in big blockbuster films. They use silence. And in that theatre I was in, you could have heard a pin drop in that place. And it was such a poignant moment. They just let the audience absorb. And when you consider the contrast too, with all of the noise and rambunctiousness that's been going on in that battle, and then just to go to pure silence, I thought there was such a poignancy. And then the way they handled that moment, I thought that was just really good.
I felt like it was extremely well conceived, in the sense that, this entire Marvel Cinematic Universe started with the first Iron Man movie. And so it could be argued that Tony Stark's character arc is really the thing that kind of ties all these movies together, because he kind of started with this whole thing. That's the first movie where we hear about the Avengers, and that movie ends with him saying, I am Iron Man. And so when you look at the bookend of that with Endgame, how does it end? It ends with Tony dying, and his last words are, "I am Iron Man." He snaps his fingers. And so, like, the bookend to Tony's story, Tony's character arc, was just so pitch perfect, because you kind of knew going in that it was either going to be Captain America or Iron Man who died. And so I feel like the choice to have Iron Man be the one to bring this phase of the Marvel Cinematic Universe to a close was appropriate, because he's the one who began it. And he was also, like, if you look at his character arc throughout the other Avengers movies and the other Iron Man movies, it's always been about him wanting to protect the world. And this was his opportunity to do that, and he succeeded. Like, if you look at Age of Ultron, in Age of Ultron, that whole storyline was motivated by Tony having seen this vision of catastrophe and him wanting to avoid that. And it was just a series of failures for him up until that point where he's like, I'm going to make the ultimate sacrifice to save everything. And the suit of armor around the world ends up being Tony. And that's why I think his final words, "I am Iron Man," were so poignant. And I really loved how they handled that character and that death in particular, because you really do see all the, how much all the other characters care about him and how they revere his sacrifice. And I will admit that the scene between Happy and Tony's daughter, where he talks about getting her all the cheeseburgers she wants, like, that got me. Yeah. I teared up a little. Yeah. So I think it was probably the most emotional part of Endgame. And I think it was really well done.
Yeah, and I agree. That scene was great as well. And I think they also did a really good job of, I think, if I'm honest, I thought Steve Rogers was going to be the one to make the sacrifice. That's what I thought was going to happen. I think most people did, right?
And if you watch the movie, in the third act, like after Thanos knocks out Iron Man and beats up Thor and just kicks the crap out of Captain America, there's this one shot. It's probably the best shot in the entire movie, where Captain America gets to his feet and it's like him against the Thanos's army. It's just like this beautifully shot thing where Captain America, he's this one guy, and you just see him standing up against impossible odds. And that's always been kind of Captain America's thing, where it's like, he never stops fighting, no matter the odds. And, when you go back to, the first Avenger, and he's up against the entire Nazi army and stuff like that, like, you see parallels with his story coming down in Endgame. And I think, like, that one shot where, that's the lowest that they can go, where Captain America is the last one standing against this unstoppable alien army. And then you just hear this, "Shh, hey, Cap, you there?" And the entire audience in the theater is just like, oh. And, like, like you said, what they play with the silence, where he's just, there's no music. There's just that, he checks his ear and you hear Anthony Mackie's voice again. He's like, "On your left." You see that circle open and three figures walk out and everyone's like, "Oh," and then, like, more circles start to appear. And then you get the final Avengers Assemble moment, where all these characters from the past 11 years and 20-something movies, every single one of them comes out and they all band together. And you have Cap give his famous Avengers Assemble line, and then they charge into battle. Like, that, to me, that's one of those moments movies are made for. And it wouldn't have had that kind of emotional payoff if Cap hadn't, done what he did and, fought as hard as he did and, just refused to give up. Because, you have to have the energy and the momentum of the film hit its lowest before you can have great moments like that. Because, it's always darkest before the dawn, that old saying. Like, you have to get as dark as possible before that payoff. Otherwise, it's not going to have the emotional effect that you want it to. And I felt like that moment made the movie for me, because it was so well done, so beautifully done, and it was just perfect. And that moment made me forgive all my misgivings leading up to it, because it was so good. It was so good.
Look, and they knew their audience, I think, too, as well. To me, that's the kind of moment that is so sorely missing from the new Star Wars trilogies. You don't get those big, emotive, wow, this is it, sort of moments in the story that really just have that heft, emotional heft to them.
I mean, like, to kind of make a equivalence to the Star Wars stuff. Like, imagine if Endgame, instead of Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor facing down with Thanos at the end, you had Captain Marvel, Ant-Man, or I should say Captain Marvel, the Wasp, and I don't know, Doctor Strange's Chinese assistant guy. Like they were the ones who defeated Thanos. And it's like, hey, these are the new characters. You should care about them. It's like, well, we kind of spent the last 10 years with these other characters. We would have liked to have seen their stories pay off before you passed on to the new characters. So, like that's how I look at this, is that Endgame brought the character arcs and the storylines of these characters that we have spent over a decade with to a close. And they've moved forward with, the new characters. Like, there's a lot of room for Captain Marvel and Black Panther and, even a new Captain America and all this stuff. Like, they set the stage for these new characters. They passed the torch, which is something that Star Wars never did. They're just like, here are new characters. You need to care about these guys now and forget about the ones that you grew up loving. And it's like, no, Marvel's like, hey, we're going to give the ones that you love a send-off, and we're going to start giving you stories with these new ones. And we're like, cool, yes, it works. I wish Lucasfilm would take some cues from that.
Well, it's not rocket science. The one thing I do want to critique, though, about that moment is Pepper Potts. Now, I love the fact that she was there, and she had to be there. For Tony Stark's death, she had to be there, I think. And I think there's also a real beautiful poignancy in the fact that her whole character arc has really been about not really seeming to accept his role as Iron Man, but by the end, she's actually the strong voice of acceptance. And you get that sense that she embraces his calling as well as her calling too. But the problem I have is that they set her up in the beginning of the film. She doesn't want to wear the suit that he's made for her. She's a mum now, living out in the wilderness, so clearly she's not a seasoned superhero. But in that battle, she turns up and all of a sudden, she is this well-honed, well-oiled fighting machine. And I thought that, for me, was a little bit frustrating. But I also understand, I balanced that against the fact they had to have her there for the death.
Well, they kind of set that up in Iron Man 3. Like, there's definitely an establishment where they've shown her fight before. So that wasn't far-fetched for me. I think just speaking from a setup and payoff thing, because like when she first kind of flies down in her silver sable outfit or whatever she's called, Iron Sable, and her mask opens up, I was like, who is that? Because I couldn't tell it was Gwyneth Paltrow at first. So, it kind of caught me off guard. Like, I would have liked to have seen one scene, maybe somewhere like in the second act, where she's with, their daughter, and she takes a look at like her suit. And the daughter's like, Mommy, why don't you ever wear the suit Daddy made you, or something like that? And like, just have a moment where you establish that she has an Iron Man suit that she can put on and fly into battle with, so that it's not so jarring when she does show up in the third act. Like, I can understand why they didn't, because they were already running long on this movie. But at the same time, it's just like little things like that, which I feel, if you do proper setup, the payoff is always really good. And, that's my take on that. Like, I didn't mind Gwyneth Paltrow showing up at the end.
Look, for me, it's a minor quibble. It's not even make or break, but it is something that for me I thought was, a little bit. And saying that, though, they'd probably argue from a writing perspective, I'd guess, that this was her acceptance. At the beginning, she wouldn't accept the suit that he'd made for her. She wasn't accepting her calling. By the end, she's accepted it. But it just feels there's a little bit missing in between. Now, we're almost done, but I want to talk about the passing of the shield to Falcon. I am a little bit frustrated by this because, for me, there's a couple of things here. Number one, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me to give it to Falcon. I think it should have been Bucky, and a couple of reasons why. I think it would have completed his redemption arc. It would have also made sense. He's a super soldier as well. The Falcon's not a super soldier. He's just got a really impressive shield now. And also, the Falcon's a well-established character. Why not establish that character and let him really grow into that character? To me, I didn't like that as much as others perhaps did.
Well, it was funny because I actually put out a tweet last October where I predicted, I was like, if Captain America dies in Endgame, don't be surprised if Marvel makes Hawkman, Anthony Mackie, the next Captain America. And I think the reason for that is, yes, he's not a super soldier, but in Captain America's eyes and opinion, he represents what it means to be Captain America. Like his patriotism and his devotion and his decision making and stuff like that, his willingness to sacrifice, that's what makes him a good Captain America. But, beyond that, it's also Marvel wanting to, diversify their main characters more. And that's something they've done in the comics. Back during the death of Captain America, I think Bucky was Captain America for a bit, and then he passed it on to the Hawkman character. I'm sorry for blanking on his actual name, but the Anthony Mackie character in the comics was Captain America for a while as well. So I think like it wasn't a surprise to me, and I felt like, okay, now I see where they're going, because before Endgame came out, they announced a Bucky and Hawkman TV show for Disney Plus, and so it's probably going to be Anthony Mackie being trained by Bucky to become a super soldier, or some quest to make him a super soldier or something. So I feel like it wasn't a surprise to me, and like I feel like the actor Anthony Mackie, he's good enough where I'd be interested to see how they play it, because there might be some resentment from Bucky of not being Captain America or something along those lines. So like we're not going to know until we see the Disney Plus show. But I feel like it's an interesting, bold choice for the MCU, and I can't really say like it's going to be stupid or dumb, because I don't know what they plan to do with it. But I'm willing to give it a shot, see where it goes, because I've been predicting it for a while now. So
you weren't so surprised or stunned?
Actually, say like a bigger issue is Captain America going back in time and living a full life, because that creates all types of continuity problems, especially with like the former Captain America movies.
Now let's get to that point, because that's something, before we finish up by talking about the couple of end scenes, I want to talk about that aspect. The fact that Steve Rogers goes back, for me, initially you're like, oh, that's lovely. He got to be back with the love of his life. Isn't that nice? But then the more you think about it, you think, hold on a minute. So he ducked out. What was he doing while all of the other stuff is going on? And you could say, well, maybe he just stays out of it, does he? And lets himself, who's not himself, do those things. Couldn't he have prevented all of these problems by intervening another way? So he's just going to stay right out of it. And then and also it's a bit like the sacrifices that he's made. I think the other things that really make a character meaningful, the depth of sacrifice that they have made to actually give of themselves to others. And now it sort of feels a bit like he's like, nah, I'd actually rather have what I want, thank you very much, and I'm going to go and get it. And they gave it to him. And to me, I'm torn about that. I just, yeah.
There are a couple issues here that come into play. My first thought was like, well, when Captain America went to return the Soul Stone, did he run into Red Skull? How was that reunion handled? It's like, what happened there? I would have liked to have seen like maybe an end credit scene where like they have like a little chit chat. Like that would have been interesting to me to see. But more so than that, him going back in time and marrying Peggy Carter and having a life with her, it creates so many questions, because it's like, well, they've established that you can't change the future by going back into the past. So like Captain America going back in the past wouldn't have changed anything. But you have things like, he visited Peggy on her deathbed in Winter Soldier. He went to her funeral. He was one of the pallbearers there. Peggy Carter was a major factor in the formation of S.H.I.E.L.D. She had dealings with Tony Stark's father and Hank Pym and Tommy Lee Jones. Like, wouldn't him marrying her or being in her life have influenced her decisions at a certain point in time? There's all these questions that you have, because it's like him being her husband and living with her and going through this time period where she was instrumental to laying the foundation for what would come in the future Marvel movies. It's like, how could he not have changed things? Like it just doesn't make any sense. Like if you stop to think about it, just based off of the rules that they established. So there's a lot of stuff there that just you can think about and not find satisfactory answers to. And, like the easiest thing is to just say like, well, Cap lived out in an alternate timeline. But if that's the case, how is he there at the end to pass on his shield and stuff? There's just so many issues with this thing. But overall, Cap going back in time, returning all the time stones, and then deciding to live his life in peace and happiness, I feel was an earned reward for that character's journey, because he always wanted to fight and do the right thing, to uphold the ideals that he believed in, and he accomplished that. And so when a soldier retires from war, he's entitled to live a good life, live a happy life, live a life out in peace. And that's what Steve got in the end. And I feel like it was a good kind of bookend to his character's journey, just like every major Avenger got a good bookend to their journey. Black Widow, she sacrificed herself to save the world. Hawkeye got his family back, and he gets to retire and live a good life with his family. The Hulk finally kind of made peace with his two warring sides, and he's able to live a life of balance without anger. Then you have Tony Stark, who saved the world and had a baby and a family and all this stuff. And then you have Thor, who kind of gives up on trying to be something he's not and just embrace his destiny as being a wanderer and an adventurer and stuff like that. And then you have Captain America, who basically just gets to live the life he has always wanted with the girl that he loves. And so you have kind of these beautiful bookends to all the central Avengers characters. And I also think it was really interesting because in the first Avengers movie, the first time Captain America, Thor, and Iron Man all come together, they fight. Like there's that big fight when the three of them kind of meet each other. And then you have this movie, the final movie. So you have the first movie where they fight each other. Then the final movie, they're walking, those three characters are walking together and fighting alongside each other. And so it's kind of like it's come full circle, where at first, they were enemies and now they're allies. And it's a beautiful kind of arc. And the great thing about Endgame at the end of the day is that it's a love letter to all the movies that came before it. Like as problematic as the time travel plot trope is in this film, we get to go back and see all these former movies that we've enjoyed over the course of like a decade, and all these characters that we'd forgotten about come back and kind of ring a little bell of memory in there. And I felt it was really beautifully well done, because like it wasn't over the top, it wasn't in your face, it was just enough to remind you of how you fell in love with this universe before they kind of bookend it. And I thought it was really well written in that regard.
Yeah, I think for me the thing with Steve Rogers is, look, I think that one thing they did incredibly well was that the facial makeup and his mannerisms and everything. I thought it actually at last an elderly character who's been aged prematurely, who actually looks and sounds and feels like an elderly character, not a young person wearing makeup. But yeah, when you do think about it, for me, I think, well, he'd know about Thanos, so surely he'd have to do something to prevent that in advance, surely. Yeah, well, and this is the thing. If they'd stuck to their own rules, I wonder whether what he could have done was actually gone back and had his brief moment with Peggy and then said, I have to go now. And it would have sealed the sacrifice or something. I don't know.
Yeah, or what about just going back in time and bringing past Peggy into the future? That seems to be all the rage, because it doesn't, you can't change the future by affecting the past. So like, why not? Other than Cap, being from that time period, he was probably more at home there with her. But at the same time, it's like, well, I mean, there's no reason not to bring her into the future. So
it's forgivable though, because he's such a lovable character, and it was, like you say, a very fitting end to give him something.
And how about the makeup and digital wizardry they did for the kind of anemic Tony Stark at the beginning, where he's been stranded in space and he's like all thin and gaunt and stuff like that. Like in addition to the old man makeup, they really like have figured out how to make believable, de-aging and like de-healthifying and all this stuff. Like the effects in this movie were pretty freaking good.
Well, I think, gone are the days where Christian Bale has to actually starve himself like he did with The Machinist and then put on heaps of weight at the other end to play this diverse character in the story. And also, because that really stuck out for me, I thought, oh my gosh, is Robert Downey Jr. okay? Is he back on drugs or something? Honestly, that's my first thought, was what's going on here. But then I saw also the de-aging they did of Michael Douglas. That face was unbelievable. Like, they really got
bad wig though. Really bad wig.
But the thing was the facial stuff. That's the hard stuff, and they really, man, they've become, I guess, the industrial light and magic of this era in many ways in that regard.
Well, I mean, the de-aging they did on Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson, in Captain Marvel was pretty impressive. Like you believed you were looking at Samuel L. Jackson from the 90s, and there's this new movie coming out called Gemini Man with Will Smith, where they'd use the de-aging technology there to make old Will Smith fight, Fresh Prince Will Smith. And it's very believable. So like they've definitely stepped up their game in the whole digital makeup department.
Let's round things out now. Just a couple of things. Number one is I felt a little bit like the ending of the film, it sort of petered out for me a little bit, rather than ending on a big crescendo moment. And as I said, I'm willing to forgive this because they're trying to wrap a whole lot of things and bookend things. But I did feel that the scene with Thor and the Guardians of the Galaxy, I felt a little bit like that was an end credit scene or a deleted scene that got tacked on, and it was funny. I thought I enjoyed it, but it did, to me, lengthen. I sort of started to notice I was sitting in my seat at that point.
Yeah, well, I feel like they needed it to kind of bring Thor's story to a conclusion. I was one of the people who I didn't mind the 12 billion different endings in Return of the King, the Lord of the Rings final movie. And I'm always one where I feel like a good denouement where, all the stuff gets wrapped up in the end in a nice tidy bow. Like, I don't mind that type of thing. I'm like, it was a funny scene with him and the Guardians of the Galaxy, but it was also kind of not only setting up future Guardians of the Galaxy stuff and future Thor stuff, but it was also a good bookend to, his character, because he's lived for 1,000 years. He's gone through all types of adventures. And this is the next phase of his life after, wrapping up the whole Avengers phase. And so, like, I was cool. I was fine with it. Wasn't bothered by it.
One last thing then, where do they go from here? What do you think's coming? What are your predictions? I guess the big question is, are they going to be able to have another decade of success on the back of this, or was this the big moment and it starts to sort of just, I don't know, the machine functions, but maybe not those same heights? What do you think?
Well, you may have to ask me when I'm 50, but like they stated that after the next Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Far From Home, that's the end of Phase 3. That's the official end, and then they're going to be moving into the next phase of their development. So my guess is they'll probably do another 3 phases, setting up like new threats and stuff. Fantastic Four and X-Men are definitely going to play a role in that. Probably not immediately, but down the line. We know for a fact that the Immortals are going to play a role going forward. Captain Marvel, she's going to have to appear in at least 5 more movies per her contract. So she's going to play a role going forward. We know the Guardians of the Galaxy are going to have at least 1 more movie. There's been talk of like a female Thor in the sense that Valkyrie, is going to kind of pick up the torch. I don't think that's going to be the case. I think Marvel likes Chris Hemsworth, and they'll probably, if they're going to do another Thor movie, they're going to bring him back. And after the success of Ragnarok, they probably will, especially with him going off with Guardians of the Galaxy, because there's more stories to be told with him. Doctor Strange and Ant-Man and Wasp, they're going to play a role going forward. And Deadpool as well. I don't know if they'll incorporate Deadpool into the MCU going forward, or if they'll keep him off in his own little stuff. But I know that they will eventually bring in X-Men and Fantastic Four, and I'm really looking forward to how they work in Fantastic Four, in the future. So, I mean, we'll see. I think that they'll build up to like a whole new, crossover threat type thing, and I hope it's Galactus or at the very least Doctor Doom, because they have these characters back. So that's kind of where I see them going, is like they'll create kind of like a new crossover threat. Also, was Adam Warlock? He'll probably be involved going forward as well. So there might be some other cosmic threat out there that they build up. So in another 10 years, we'll have like another Endgame scenario where all the new Avengers get together. I know that there's also talk of Brie Larson directing an all-female Avengers movie. And they kind of set the stage for that in this film, where you had that girl power moment during the final battle, where all the female characters kind of got together and rallied around Captain Marvel to keep her safe while she tried to get rid of the Infinity Gauntlet. But before we sign off, there was one thing that I wanted to touch on, which I felt was a major plot hole not a whole lot of people are talking about. And that is that at the midpoint of the film, Thanos learns what the Avengers are doing, and that kind of starts down the road to the final act where he shows up and tries to get the gauntlet. And that's because future Nebula travels back in time, and for some reason her circuits are linked with past Nebula, and so Thanos is able to read future Nebula's mind and see the events that happened. And once future Nebula regains control, she realizes Thanos knows what's happening, and so she tries to warn Hawkeye and Widow, and then gets captured by Thanos. And I'm like, wait a minute, why didn't, the moment that Thanos almost captures her, why didn't she just time travel away and warn the future Avengers about this? Because she had the Pym particle, because her past self stole it so she could travel, to the present. It's like, what was stopping her from escaping that by just traveling forward in time? Didn't make any sense, other than the fact that you needed her to be captured in order to advance the plot forward. So that was probably my biggest writing peeve with this movie, was like that was something that was definitely engineered because they couldn't figure out a better way to do it. So
before I talk about perhaps the future of Marvel, my take on this film is, I think once the hype dies down, it's still very much in the hype phase, and everyone's just got their rose-tinted glasses on over this film. But I think when the hype does die down a little bit, we'll probably see a lot more of that critiquing of some of those things that you can really pull apart at the seams with this film. That's my take.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a whole lot to pull apart here. There are like a couple, I'd say like maybe 3 or 4 major issues that you could kind of debate. But overall, it's a good film. And because it's a good film, I feel like people, especially once you're able to double feature it, like watch Infinity War and then go right into Endgame, I think a lot of people are going to be fine with it. I don't think it's going to be one of those things where, like, for instance, there are some people, they watched The Last Jedi, they liked it in the theater, and then upon further viewings, they're just like, ooh, just picking apart every little thing, rightfully so. Like, I don't feel like this movie has that. Like, no movie's perfect. You can go back, you could look at classic movies like Indiana Jones, Back to the Future, stuff like that, and you can find nitpicks and issues with those films, but they're still enjoyable, good movies. I feel like Endgame kind of falls into that category, where even though like you could debate, certain plot points and character development things and stuff like that, continuity issues, but overall it's still like, that third act of Endgame, I think, forgives a lot of the issues leading up to that point, because it was just so epic and so well done. I must have watched that final battle 3 or 4 times already, because I've gone and seen the movie a couple times now, and like that final battle is just so well done. It's just so epic, and I'm willing to forgive a lot for that type of payoff.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think
a lot of people will be too.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, right? There's so much of that is good about the film, that even the stuff where you look at it and you go, no, that wasn't so good, you actually really are willing to forgive. And that's probably, when you think about something, say, The Last Jedi, it doesn't have that moment that allows people to give it a bit of leeway. There's no payoff.
It has more moments that make you want to tear it apart. Yeah. It's just like, you think that movie couldn't get any worse, and then it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. But with Endgame, if you just turn your brain off and watch the movie and accept it for what it is, it's perfect.
Yeah.
If you look at it critically, there may be like a handful of issues, but nothing that is so bad that it'll ruin your enjoyment of the film.
No, it's still a good film. I think for me going forward, I think the problem they have is that they've got heaps of potential. So that can be a risk. Where do you take all of that potential they've got? Because amazingly, they've got a whole lot of untapped story potential, really, to draw on. And ironically, that presents risk as well. But also, I see that they're going to have to discover effectively, I think, some new talent to really take the lead. It's clearly not, I mean, unless some miracle happens, Brie Larson is not the charismatic face. Like they had Robert Downey Jr. You've got these, he really, I think, was the linchpin. And then he had these other characters around where the chemistry and who they were as actors, really, it all just worked. And I don't see them having that at the moment. To me, that's possibly the missing factor here. Where do they get that chemistry that you need?
Yeah, I think that Benedict Cumberbatch is probably going to play a larger role going forward because he's probably the best actor they got right now. And if they can work out their issues with Sony, Spider-Man will probably, take a more forward, role in the MCU. I know that their plan right now is to, kind of build a lot of stuff around Captain Marvel, but I'm starting to think that some of them might realize that's a little bit problematic. So I'm not sure how important of a role she's going to have going forward. A big issue that you have to take into account with the future of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is Disney Plus, because we've got, a Loki series, we've got a Hawkman or Hawk and Bucky show, and we've also got a potential Hawkeye show. So we've got 3 kind of mini series planned that dovetail right into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and those things are probably going to set up future movies as well. And then we have future movies which may set up future Disney Plus series as well. So there's going to be like an interesting kind of dynamic where they can set up something on a TV show, pay it off in a movie, or do the reverse and set up something in a movie, pay it off in a TV show. So there's a lot of leeway for them going forward on how they want to handle these characters and how they want to set up new characters. So I guess we'll just wait and see. But I think that you're going to see Doctor Strange kind of take the Iron Man role. I think you're going to see kind of Spider-Man step up, take maybe the Thor role. You might see new characters like a new version of Wolverine come into the Avengers. You're going to see a new Captain America kind of step up. So, and then you got a bunch of female characters which might, suddenly take prominence into the MCU. So there's a lot of potential there. I guess we'll just have to wait and see how they plan to use it.
Matthew, thanks for coming back. It was awesome to have you again on the channel. Long may it continue. You are a writer. How do people get a hold of your books? How do they follow you? Give them all your details.
Yeah, if you guys want to follow me on Twitter, I'm pretty active on there. I'm at Matthew Kadish, MatthewKadish. Always looking to gain more followers because I talk a lot about movies and writing and Star Wars and stuff like that on there. And I also link to my articles on Medium. If you want to check out my books, you can go to kadishbooks.com, KADISHBOOKS.com. And that just links to my Amazon page. So you can go there and find all my books. And that's pretty much it.
Matthew, thanks. It was awesome to have you again, mate.
Thanks. Always happy to be on.
As per usual, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know what you think in the comments section below. And if you like the content I'm creating and you'd like to see more of it, then please consider financially supporting the channel. The links for how you can do that are found in the video description below. See you next time on Left Foot Media. Thanks for watching.